Hi, fourth graders. Happy Friday. It is our last Fluency Friday and the last time I'm going to read from this book because we are on chapter 20 of The Borrowers. And, I hope that you read it and followed along and enjoyed it. I know some of you have, so thank you for that. I'm glad you liked it. And then when this is done, you get to go watch the movie, so that's pretty exciting. So let's read chapter 20. "Brr!" exclaimed Kate. "Didn't he see them come out?" "No." Mrs. Driver came along then, in a flurry of annoyance because they were late for the train. She bustled into the cab because she wanted to get back again, she said, as fast as she could, to be in at the death. Driver was like that. Kate was silent for a moment, looking down. "So that is it? The end?" she said at last. "Yes," said Mrs. May. "It could be, or the beginning." But Kate raised her worried voice. "Perhaps they didn't escape through the grating." "Oh, they escaped all right," said Mrs. May lightly. "But how do you know?" "I just know," said Mrs. May. "But how did they get across those fields with cows and things and the crows?" "They walked, I suppose. The Hendreries did it. People can do anything when they have a mind to." "But poor Homily, she'd be so upset." "She was upset," said Mrs. May. "And how would they know the way?" "By the gas pipe," said Mrs. May. "There's a kind of ridge all along through the spinnity and across the fields." Not spinity, I'm sorry. The spinney. I can't find my reading glasses. I apologize. The spinney, not spinnity. The spinney and across the fields. You see, when men dig a trench and put a pipe in it, all the earth they've dug out doesn't quite fit when they've put it back. The ground looks different. But poor Homily, she didn't have her tea on her, or her furniture, or her carpets, or anything. Do you suppose they took anything with them? "Oh, people will always grab something," said Mrs. May shortly. "The oddest thing sometimes. If you read about shipwrecks," she spoke hurriedly, as though she were tired of the subject. "Do be careful, child. Not gray next to pink. You'll have to unpick it." But Kate went on in a despairing voice as she picked up the scissors, "Homily would hate to arrive there all poor and destitute in front of Loopy." "Destitute," said Mrs. May patiently. "And Loopy wasn't there to remember." "Oh, wait. Loopy wasn't there, remember? Loopy never came back. And you know what Homily would do? Can't you see her? She'd be in her element. She would tie on her apron at once and cry, 'These poor silly men,' and she'd bustle and fuss and cook and clean and make them wipe their feet when they came in." "On what?" asked Kate. "On a piece of moss, of course, laid down on the floor." Were there all boys?" Kate asked after a moment. "Yes, the harpsichords and the clocks, and they'd spoil Ariette dreadfully." "What did they eat? Did they eat caterpillars, do you think?" "Oh, goodness, child, of course they didn't. They had a wonderful life, all that Ariette had ever dreamed of. They could live very well. Badgers' sets are almost like villages, full of passages and chambers and storehouses. They could gather hazelnuts and beechnuts and chestnuts. They could gather corn, which they could store and grind into flour, just as humans do. It was all there for them. They didn't even have to plant it. They had honey. They could make elderflower tea and lime. They had hips, excuse me. They had hips and haws and blackberries and sloes and wild strawberries. The boys could fish in the stream, and the minnow to them would be as big as a mackerel is to you. They had birds' eggs, any amount of them, for custards and cakes and omelets. You see, they would know where to look for things, and they had greens and salads, of course. Think of a salad made of those tender shoots of young hawthorn, bread and cheese, we used to call it, with dandelion and a sprinkling of thyme and wild garlic. Homily was a good cook, remember? It wasn't for nothing that the clocks lived under the kitchen. But the danger, said Kate. The weasels and the crows and the stoats, all of those things. Yes, agreed Mrs. May. Of course there were danger. There's danger everywhere, but no more for them than for many human beings. At least they didn't have wars. And what about early settlers in America, and those people who farm in the middle of the big game country in Africa and on the edge of the jungles in India? They get to know the habits of the animals. Few animals kill for the sake of killing, even rabbits know when a fox isn't hunting, and they will run quite near him when he's full fed and lazing in the sun. These were boys, remember? They would learn to hunt for the pot, and how to protect themselves. I don't suppose Arrietty and Homily would wander far afield. Arrietty would, Kate said. Yes, agreed Mrs. May, laughing. I suppose she would. So they'd have meat, said Kate. Yes, sometimes, but borrowers are borrowers, not killers, I think, said Mrs. May. And if a fox killed a rabbit, they'd use the fur. Yes, for rugs and things. Supposing then, Kate said, when they had a little roast, they skinned haws and baked them, and would they taste like brown potatoes? Perhaps, said Mrs. May, but they couldn't cook in a badger's set. I suppose they couldn't cook. They cooked out of doors. How would they keep warm in the winter? Do you know what I think, said Mrs. May. She laid down her work and leaned for a little. I think they didn't live in the badger's set at all. I think they used it with all the passages and storerooms as a great honeycomb of an entrance hall. None but they would know the secret way through the tunnels which led at last to their homes. Borrowers love passages, they love gates, and they love to live a long way from their own front door. Where would they live then, I was wondering, said Mrs. May, about the gas pipe. Oh, yes, cried Kate. I see what you mean. The soil is soft and sandy. I think they'd go right through the badger's set and dig out a circular chamber level with the gas pipe. And off this chamber, all around it, there'd be little rooms like cabins. And I think, said Mrs. May, that they'd bore three little pinholes in the gas pipe. One would be so tiny you could hardly see it. One would always be lit. The other two would have stoppers in them, which then would be light. Which when they wanted to light the gas, they would pull out. They would light the bigger ones from the small burner. That's where they'd cook, and that's what would give them light. But would they be so clever? But they are clever, said Mrs. May. She assured her. Very clever. Much too clever to live near a gas pipe and not use it. They're borrowers, remember? But wouldn't they want a little air hole? Oh, said Mrs. May quickly, they didn't have one. How do you know? Asked Kate. Because once when I was up there, I smelled a hot pipe. Oh, cried Kate excitedly, and twisted around and knelt up on the hassock. So did you go up there? So that's how you know. You know them too. No, said Mrs. May, drawing back a little in her chair. I never saw them. Not never. But you went up there. You know something. I know. I can see you know. Yes, I went up there, Mrs. May scared back into Kate's eager face. Hesitant, she seemed, almost a little guilty. Well, she conceded at last, I'll tell you, for what it's worth. When I went to stay in that house, it was just before Aunt Sophie went in the nursing home. I knew the place was going to be sold, so again, Mrs. May hesitated, almost shyly. Well, I took all the furniture out of the doll's house and put it in the pillowcase and took it up there. I bought things out of my own pocket money, tea and coffee beans and salt and pepper, cloves and great packet of lump sugar. And I took a whole lot of little pieces of silk, which were over from making a patchwork quilt. And I took them some fish bones for needles. I took the tiny thimble I had gotten in a Christmas pudding, and a whole collection of scraps and cracker things I'd had in a chocolate box. But you never saw them? No, I never saw them. I sat for hours against the bank below the hawthorn hedge. It was a lovely bank, twined with twisted hawthorn roots and riddled with sandy holes, and there were wood violet, primroses, and beautiful flowers. From the top of the bank, you could see for miles across the fields. You could see the woods and the valleys and the twisting lanes. You could see the chimneys of the house. Perhaps it was in the wrong place. I don't think so. Sitting there in the grass, half dreaming and watching beetles and ants, I found an oak apple. It was smooth and polished and dry. There was a hole bored inside the side of it and a slice off the top. The teapot, exclaimed Kate. I think so. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the quill spout. I called them down all the holes as my brother had done, but no one answered. Next day, when I went up there, the pillowcase had gone. And everything in it? Yeah, everything in it. Yes, everything in it. I searched the ground for yards around in case there might be a scrap of silk or a coffee bean, but there was nothing, of course. Somebody passing might have just picked it up and carried it away. That was the day, said Mrs. May, that I smelled hot pot. And which was the day, asked Kate, that you found Ariette's diary. Mrs. May laid down her work. Kate, she began in a startled voice, and then uncertainly she smiled. What makes you say that? Her cheeks had become quite pink. I guessed, said Kate. I knew there was something you wouldn't tell me, like reading somebody else's diary. It wasn't a diary, said Mrs. May hastily, but her cheeks had become even pinker. It was a book called Memoranda, the book with blank pages. That's where she'd written it, and it wasn't on that day I found it, but 3 weeks later, the day before I left. Kate sat silent, staring at Mrs. May. After a while, she drew a long breath. Then that proves it, she said finally, underground chamber and all. Not quite, said Mrs. May. Why not? Asked Kate. Ariette used to make her E apostrophe F S like a half moon with a stroke in the middle. Well, said Kate. Mrs. May laughed and took up her work again. My brother did too, she said. And that is the end of chapter 20. So we will talk about the rest of this book on Monday and how it ended and what you guys thought. Have a wonderful weekend. And please feel free to get on Netflix and watch The Secret World of Ariette. I hope it's there. It seemed like it was. Enjoy.